Welcome, everyone, to Revolutionary Art on Telegraph Hill, the Coit Tower murals, with a distinguished guest, Dr. Robert Cherny. I'm Harvey Smith, author of Berkeley and the New Deal, and project advisor to the Living New Deal, which brings you tonight's webinar. The Living New Deal began at the University of California, Berkeley in 2007. Our mission is to preserve the New Deal's lessons and legacy by making people aware of what the New Deal was and did, and to promote the New Deal as a model for government today. In our conversation tonight, we will discuss the controversies over the New Deal era murals at San Francisco's landmark Coit Tower. In 2014, I was invited by the San Francisco Art Commission to write new interpretive signage for the 27 murals in the tower's interior. These murals, painted in 1934, were done under the first federal art project, the short-lived Public Works of Art project during the Great Depression, a tumultuous time in San Francisco. The murals at Coit Tower comprise an amazing collection of New Deal artworks by some of the most recognized and politically controversial artists of the day, many of whom worked with the master Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, whose influence can be felt as one circumnavigates the interior of the tower. Tonight's guest, Professor Robert Cherny, will discuss the significance of these provocative murals at the time and even now, 90 years later. Robert Cherny is Professor Emeritus of History at San Francisco State University, where he taught from 1971 to 2012. Bob's scholarly publications focus on U.S. political history and the history of California and the West. He is author or co-author of many monographs and many published essays. His last 4 books have centered on the 1930s in San Francisco and include Harry Bridges, Labor Radical, Labor Legend, Victor Arnatuoff, and the Politics of Art, San Francisco Reds, Communist in the Bay Area, and the Coit Tower murals, New Deal and Political Controversy in San Francisco, published in November 2024. Bob, it's a pleasure to have you as tonight's speaker.
Thanks very much, Harvey. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to the Living New Deal Project for making this all possible. I'm going to share screen now, and we can get started. What I'm going to do today is give you a very quick overview of what's in my book, and then I'll be happy to take questions and comments. In 1933, San Francisco, like the rest of the nation, was near the pit of the Great Depression. Unemployment reached 25%. Unemployed men, as you see in the photograph, lined up on the waterfront to get a free meal. The local Communist Party was very visible. In October 1933, Communist organizers led a strike of 12,000 agricultural workers in the cotton fields of southern San Joaquin Valley. In the early 1930s, communist candidates could get as many as 10,000 votes in city elections in San Francisco. The party's newspaper, the Western Worker, was available throughout the city. Even though the communists had fewer than 1,000 actual members in San Francisco, the party was a much more visible presence. Amid this economic distress and calls for change, for radical change, artists produced spectacular murals in Coit Tower. Coit Tower dominates the Northeast waterfront. It was created with a bequest in the will of Lily Hitchcock Coit to, quote, add to the beauty of the city. This tower was completed in October 1933. My book describes these 4 elements that came together to produce the murals at Coit Tower. and I will expand on each of these in turn. I've already mentioned the Great Depression as part of this larger context. One pole of the city's art community was the California School of Fine Arts, which then was a recent occupant of this campus on Russian Hill. The other pole of the arts community was this neighborhood that housed many studios of faculty members, students, and alumni of the California School of Fine Arts, along with a lot of other artists, beginning over here in the Montgomery block and including a number of the buildings in this block on Montgomery Street, north of Washington. Victor Arnatuoff completed this mural on the wall of his studio in early 1932, depicting many of the young artists in that neighborhood. The names in orange are those who later worked at Coit Tower, and those in blue did other murals at the same time under PWAP auspices. Diego Rivera was a major influence on San Francisco artists. He had studied painting in Madrid, Paris, and Italy. In Italy, he was attracted to fresco buono painting. Fresco, or true fresco, is a technique in which ground pigments in water are applied to wet plaster. That means the painting is not on the wall, but that instead it becomes part of the wall. In Mexico, in 1923, Rivera began to paint on the first of what became many large fresco murals in public buildings. His frescoes attracted attention around the world. Ralph Stackpole, a faculty member at the California School of Fine Arts, as you see here, knew Rivera from their student days in Paris. And Stackpole was instrumental in bringing Rivera to San Francisco to paint this mural at the new Stock Exchange Tower in 1931. And he went from there to do this mural at the California School of Fine Arts. By late 1933, members of the San Francisco arts community were well familiar with Rivera's work. Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in March 1933. George Biddle, on the right here, a longtime friend of Roosevelt, was very impressed by the work of Rivera and the other Mexican muralists. He encouraged Roosevelt to create similar modernist art in public buildings. Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins you see here on the left, were then trying to deal with massive unemployment. They created the first federal program to provide work relief to the unemployed, initially through grants to states. Later, in 1933, they created the Civil Works Administration to provide direct federal work relief through the winter. In December 1933, the convergence of Biddle's urging and Hopkins' work led to the creation of the Public Works of Art Project as part of the Civil Works Administration. Roosevelt appointed a San Franciscan, Edward Bruce, to administer the PWAP. Both programs, the CWA and the PWAP, were intended to be temporary, just to get the nation's unemployed through the winter. PWAP funding expired on April 28. Remember this photo, you're going to see another version of it later. San Francisco became District 15 of PWAP, and Walter Heil, head of the DeYoung Museum, was named director. Heil and his planning committee worked fast. They soon fixed upon Coit Tower as a place to create murals in the style of Diego Rivera. Heil and his committee chose the artists with advice from Stackpole. Several had worked with Rivera, including Victor Arnatuoff, who was designated as technical coordinator. The artists agreed that they'd follow the palette, style, and technique of Rivera. Directives from Washington specified that the subject matter for PWAP art should be the American scene in all its aspects. The local planning committee further defined the subject to be present-day California life. The artists were all paid the same, $30 for a 30-hour week, $1 an hour. However, $1 in 1933 had about the same purchasing power as about $24 today, so well over our current minimum wage. However, all the evidence indicates that the artists all probably worked much more than 30 hours a week. The ground floor was for murals on agriculture, industry, and city life. The second floor was for recreation and home life. This diagram shows the original ground floor design. And I'll now give you a very quick tour of the murals beginning at the entrance, but I'm going to move very quickly. Upon entering, this mural provides an indication of what lies on either side: agriculture to the left, industry to the right. Ray Boynton began teaching at the California School of Fine Arts in 1919 and was teaching classes on fresco by the mid-1920s. Facing the agriculture side of Boynton's mural, Gordon Langdon painted this mural with logging on the left, dairying in the center, and beef cattle on the right. Just around the corner from Langdon's beef cattle, Ray Bertrand continued the theme of agriculture with a slaughterhouse and a butcher shop, providing a link to the mural on the other end of the east corridor, which shows a lunch counter. Clifford White did these two tall figures on either side of the east windows, continuing the theme of agriculture. The tall figures around the Coit Tower windows are reminiscent of Rivera's giant construction worker at the California School of Fine Arts. Maxine Albro's large mural faces the east windows and presents a variety of agricultural work, including viticulture, winemaking, fruit raising, and flower raising. Note the blue eagle on the orange crates. This was a symbol of the National Recovery Administration, the best-known symbol of the New Deal as of 1934. This mural with a department store and wine shop is opposite Albro's mural on agriculture. The wine shop links to the winery in Albro's mural and is another reminder that Prohibition had ended just a few weeks before this project started. Next to the department store mural on the south wall, George Harris presented the agricultural commodities market up here in the upper left, with prices plummeting, another link to agriculture. And then the stock market over here, again with prices crashing. Then the legal profession and banking signalized by the Federal Reserve Board District 12. Hold on. There we go. Victor Arnatuoff's mural faces the south windows, from which it is possible to see the Montgomery block, and he placed a street sign for Washington and Montgomery in his mural. The right side of Arnatuoff's mural includes the old produce market at the foot of Market Street, linking to the agricultural scenes around the corner. And on the left, he presented industrial scenes connecting to the industrial scenes around that corner. In the distance, two cars have crashed in front of the Pacific Coast Stock Exchange, creating a stock market crash. Next to the newsstand on Montgomery Street in the financial district, Arnatuoff showed a well-dressed man being robbed by two other well-dressed men, perhaps his comment on life in the financial district. Harold Mallet Dean created these two large figures on either side of the south windows. Stockbroker is probably modeled after A.P. Giannini, founder of the Bank of America, and scientist inventor is modeled after Nobel Prize winner Albert Michelson, a physicist. Bernard Zuckheim's library mural completes the section on city life. Zuckheim put some political content up front with bold newspaper headlines that include many issues of the day. 4 other of the artists also used newspaper headlines to comment on life in early 1934. Zuckheim also painted a man modeled on John Langley Howard, one of the other artists, pulling down a copy of Karl Marx's Das Kapital from the library shelves. Suzanne Schroyer's mural of newspaper publishing is on the west wall around the corner from Zuckheim's library, providing a transition from city life to industry. Ralph Stackpole was both sculptor and painter and is probably best known today for his sculptures. But this is his mural. The left side of his mural depicts metalworking, oil refining, and chemicals, and the right side depicts food canning and sugar refining, all of these major components of the Bay Area's industrial economy in the early 1930s. The blue eagle appears again here on sacks of sugar. Clifford White, who did the large figures of the farmer and cowboy along the east windows, did these large figures along the west windows. From these windows, it was possible to see steel workers constructing the Golden Gate Bridge. William Hesthal's waterfront on the right seems moribund, but the workers on the left are removing weeds from the tracks and giving the locomotive a clear path, perhaps a metaphor for the New Deal beginning to roll. John Langley Howard's mural shows oil drilling on the right, hydroelectric power in the upper center, and victims of the Great Depression in the lower center, including unemployed men panning for gold, which was happening at the time, and a homeless family living in a tent. On the left, as one faces Howard's mural, he presented another depiction of the Great Depression, unemployed men marching on May Day. Of the muralists, of all the muralists, Howard created the most dramatic depictions of the Great Depression. And we are now back to where we began, and we are about to enter the elevator lobby by passing under a grape arbor, part of Boynton's mural. There are 4 large and 3 small murals in the elevator lobby, all with oil paint on canvas rather than fresco. Those artists who had never worked with fresco and preferred to work with oil paint on canvas were given this separate area, and they were all told to do landscapes. Lucien Lebeau's mural covers both sides of the stairway to the second floor. It's the largest of all the murals. It presents life on fashionable and affluent Powell Street, from Market Street all the way to the top of Nob Hill. On the left, bottom left here, are Lebeau's portraits of Edward Bruce, Eleanor Roosevelt, and L.W. Robert, based on the photograph you saw earlier, but he added in some local people to the group. This is the original plan for the upper floor, which is narrow and curved, making it difficult to get photos of the murals, and I'm sure making it difficult for the artists who were working in such close quarters. After coming up the steps, Ralph Chessie's Children at Play is on one's right. Parker Hall's mural of collegiate sports is in an alcove on one's left at the top of the stairs. And Edward Terada's mural of sports faces that of Hall. Both Hall and Terada included women's sports as well as men's sports at a time long before Title X required that colleges treat women's sports equally. Ben Cunningham's mural of outdoor recreation is along a curved hallway on either side of and over the door to what was then the caretaker's apartment. Edith Hamlin painted these scenes around the second floor elevator doors opposite Cunningham's mural. Hamlin's deer, there on the upper left, over the entrance to the last room, is looking at Cunningham's deer in his mural just around the corner. Jane Berlandina's mural on home life is in the last room, a separate room. Her style and palette marked her as a rebel against the agreement to use Rivera's palette and technique. She instead painted on dry plaster using tempera. Like those who preferred to paint with oil on canvas, Berlandina was given a separate room. That completes the murals. From early January through the end of March and into April, Coit Tower was what Walter Heil called, quote, a swarming beehive of master artists, assistants, and plasterers, as well as newspaper reporters. There were some 60 people involved, although not all of them were present at the same time. Artists worked in shifts, since the plasterers could prepare only so much fresh plaster at once. Suzanne Scheuer remembered that her shift began at 5 a.m. Given the many people in the tower, the artists used each other as models, and you see several examples here of artists who were painted by other artists. Before beginning to paint, the artists had to present half-inch to 1-foot drawings of their proposed murals for approval. Several of those scale drawings, along with initial sketches and watercolors, are at the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts at the California Palace of the Legion of Honor. Comparing the surviving drawings with the finished murals indicates that the artists made some modifications, but nearly all were relatively minor. Zarkheim, for example, showed in his drawing that half of his library mural would depict people reading newspapers, but he selected the headlines day by day based on what caught his eye in the daily press. Arnatuoff in his sketch, depicted the crowded downtown streets, but he did not include his painting of a man being robbed. Howard departed the most from his initial sketch. His initial sketch depicted his assigned subject, mineral extraction and hydroelectric power. But when he put his mural on the wall, he put those topics in the background and used the foreground to present victims of the Depression. Howard later remembered that he had not consulted anyone about his changes. When comparing the artist's initial drawings with their final murals, Howard was clearly the exception. The large majority of the artists kept very close to their early designs, and they only modified details. About 8 weeks into the work, an event in New York City sent shockwaves through the nation's art communities. Diego Rivera had been commissioned to create a large mural in Rockefeller Center, then under construction. When he included a portrait of Lenin, Nelson Rockefeller told him to remove it. Rivera refused. Rockefeller stopped work on the mural, covered it, and had it destroyed. San Francisco newspapers carried the story on February 13th. The next day, the Artists and Writers Union, then just a few months old, held this protest meeting outside Coit Tower. Many of the Coit Tower artists took part. Headlines about the protest appear in Zarkheim's mural of a public library and Vidar's mural of a department store lunch counter. Albro's mural includes a large stand of calla lilies, a flower associated with Rivera. The Coit Tower muralists were soon to experience their own controversy. Nearly all the artists had finished when the PWAP funding ran out on April 28, and many had finished weeks earlier. Scheuer announced that the work was complete in a newspaper headline in her mural dated simply April. A few of the artists, those with the largest areas, had not finished by then. Heil secured funds from the State Emergency Relief Administration to allow those artists to finish. By mid-June, everything was complete and a cleanup was in progress. Plans called for a grand opening in early July. Then controversy erupted. Late in the process, the areas above the 3 ground floor windows had been assigned to the artists who had painted the tall figures beside those windows. The areas above the windows were considered so minor that the artists were not required to submit sketches for prior approval. Above the west windows, Clifford White placed three symbols. On the left, which you can't see in the photo, a dollar sign and the motto, "In God We Trust," which was his version of capitalism. In the center, the Blue Eagle of the New Deal, which you can see. And on the right, the communist hammer and sickle with the motto, "Workers of the World Unite." Arthur Brown Jr., the architect of Coit Tower and one of the city's most prominent architects, had been hesitant about the murals from the beginning. He saw White's hammer and sickle on June 23, and he promptly informed Herbert Fleischacker, who was a banker, philanthropist, a political mover and shaker, the head of the Park Commission, and a member of the Art Commission, and told him about the mural, about the hammer and sickle. Fleischacker then told Heil to deal with the situation. All the murals then received close scrutiny. Sackheim's mural included the Western Worker, the local communist newspaper, and books by leftist authors. In the center of Sackheim's mural, a man reaches for Marx's Das Kapital. Howard's mural included the Western Worker and a group of angry men demonstrating on May 1st. Arnatuoff put the communist publications New Masses and Daily Worker on one of his newsstands. The park department locked the tower, canceled the opening date, and whitewashed the windows to prevent anyone from seeing inside. By then, San Francisco was in the midst of a Red Scare. 6 weeks before, on May 9th, longshore workers had gone on strike at all Pacific Coast ports. Other maritime workers followed, shutting down most shipping. Shipping executives quickly blamed communists, as did most of the city's newspapers and many of the city's political and business leaders. Fear of a red menace escalated after July 5th. When an effort to open the port using strike breakers protected by the city police brought resistance from strikers and strike sympathizers. Police responded with force, killing 2 and seriously injuring more than 100. Late that same day, the governor sent in the National Guard to protect the strike breakers with machine guns and tanks. Also on July 5th, the San Francisco Examiner published a photograph under the heading "Soviet Symbol in Tower," combining White's hammer and sickle with the part of Sackheim's mural depicting a man reaching for Das Kapital. The article labeled the work "Communist Propaganda." Heil telegraphed Bruce in Washington for advice. Bruce told him the best way to clean it up is to destroy the white painting. 16 of the Coit Tower artists agreed on July 30th, requesting immediate removal of what they called the offending work. The striking longshore and maritime unions returned to work the very next day on July 31st, and the Red Scare began to die down. On August 1st, a special committee of the Art Commission recommended, for artistic reasons, that, quote, "the panels over the west, south, and east windows in the main floor be removed," unquote. The full commission unanimously approved the changes, quote, "for the adornment and beautification of the interior of Coit Tower." There was no mention of censorship, and that was done. On Howard's mural, the Western Worker banner was painted over. It used to be up here. On Sackheim's mural, the hammer and sickle in the banner of the Western Worker seems to have been blurred, but there were no other changes in the murals. Coit Tower opened to the public on October 12th, 1934. The art critics were enthusiastic. But in the late 1930s, a new Red Scare developed as accusations of communist influence in New Deal programs intensified at the national level. In 1938, the House of Representatives created its Special Committee on Un-American Activities, which soon claimed that some WPA projects were infested with communists. And once again, Coit Tower murals were branded as unpatriotic, as communist propaganda. In mid-1941, Mayor Angelo Rossi received an angry letter claiming that a taxpayer was, quote, greatly shocked at the glaring propaganda that screams communism, and demanded that something be done about the radical propaganda. Rossi appointed a committee of 3 members of the Art Commission and 1 member of the Parks Commission. After they visited Coit Tower, the press reported that the art commissioners, quote, took the murals very placidly, but not Park Commissioner Lerman. The paper described him as spluttering with rage and quoted him as saying that some of the murals were objectionable, awful, terrible, and communistic. Ralph Stackpole entered the fray, stating, quote, the Coit Tower murals are dated 1934. Anyone with a memory can recall the struggle and effort to get out of the Great Depression. If a little current thought of the time is in the Coit murals, a little marks in the library scene, some solemn sternness in the strikers' faces, they should not be condemned by some hothead now. Prejudices grow. They might even grow to the actual point of having the murals destroyed. Then next would come the books. The city attorney, John O'Toole, specified that art in the possession of the city and county could not be removed, relocated, or altered in any way without the approval of the Art Commission. The Parks Commission then adopted a long resolution stating that in their opinion, the murals by Howard and Zackheim and part of Arnatuoff's mural were, quote, objectionable, designed to create and arouse class hatred, and that it was our patriotic duty to remove these murals. They sent the resolution to the Art Commission and asked the Art Commission to approve removing the murals. However, the minutes of the Art Commission fail even to mention that resolution or the controversy more generally. The Art Commissioners simply ignored it all. After World War II, the Cold War brought renewed attacks on anyone or anything linked to the Communist Party. HUAC generated nationwide headlines. Senator Joseph McCarthy was so prominent that McCarthyism became a new noun. 1953, not surprisingly, brought an attack on the murals by Anton Refrigier at the Rincon Annex Post Office. And some San Franciscans again complained about communist propaganda at Coit Tower. However, in 1953, in the midst of McCarthyism, San Francisco's public officials took no notice, simply ignoring it. In 1984, Coit Tower with its murals was designated a city landmark, and they were added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2008. Chiori Santiago in 1992 described Coit Tower and its murals as, you see here, our Statue of Liberty, our Parthenon, our Sistine Chapel. It's as much a portrait of another era as those world-class monuments. And that's the brief overview of the book. I also look at subsequent New Deal art policies and the later work of the Coit Tower muralists. They completed about 100 works of art under the various New Deal art programs. And I also look at the views of art historians. And toward the end, I also look at some subsequent political controversy over the city's other New Deal art. I introduced the book with this epigram, quoting Ralph Stackpole from 1941 about prejudices grow. They might even grow to the actual point of having the murals destroyed. And then next would come the books. And I then added a list of book bans. And I include with this argument that the most important lesson to take away from the San Francisco experience is that New Deal art should be preserved regardless of the objections of today's critics. They are historical artifacts. Public officials should not destroy yesterday's public art because that would deprive people tomorrow from drawing their own conclusions about it. New Deal art, considered in the context of its time and with appreciation for the intent of the artist, will continue to be reinterpreted in the future, but that cannot happen if the art is destroyed. As to the murals, were they revolutionary? I would say yes, but not because of the few political statements in the murals. They were revolutionary in two ways. They were part of the New Deal's first program to provide federal work relief for the unemployed, one of the New Deal programs that for the first time in U.S. history were designed to redistribute wealth. The murals and other New Deal art were also revolutionary in their commitment to democratizing public art, in their commitment to make art both easily available and easily accessible to ordinary members of the public. You don't need to understand complex classical allegories or recognize obscure historical allusions in order to understand New Deal murals. This was art about ordinary people for ordinary people, and that had never been done before in public buildings. And I'll close with some sources if you want to go further. My book on the Coit Tower murals, up in the upper left, Masha Zakheim's book, which is also an excellent source of information about the murals, but it is unfortunately out of print. My biography of Victor Arnatuoff includes a section on the murals, and I have an article in California History about San Francisco's New Deal art more generally, and many of the more recent controversies. And so that concludes my discussion. I'm going to turn off the screen sharing. And we can take questions and comments.
Okay, Bob, thank you so much. And there are a lot of questions already. To start with, what led you to write this book and your other book on Victor Arnatuoff?
Well, this book came about through a kind of a combination of a lot of things. I knew about the Coit Tower murals. I can't remember the first time that I went to see them, but I really saw them the first time when Masha Zakheim gave me a guided tour and then gave me a copy of her book, which I read carefully, and I learned something in it about the various artists, including Victor Arnatuoff. And then later, many years later, I was asked if I would do a lecture about one of Arnatuoff's murals, which at that time I hadn't even seen the mural in question. It's one at the Presidio of San Francisco. So in order to prepare for that lecture, I ordered a copy of his papers from the Archives of American Art. And they sent me a roll of microfilm, and I spent a couple of weeks that summer cranking through the microfilm, and I decided there was a really interesting book here. And so that's the source of the Arnatuoff biography. Arnatuoff, as one of the key artists at Coit Tower, again, revived my interest in those murals, led me to do an article about the controversy that was published in the Argonaut, which is the San Francisco Historical Society's journal, which led to a request from California History for me to do something about all of San Francisco's New Deal art, which I did. And at the time, I was also doing a lot of other research on San Francisco in the 1930s, which included the book on the biography of Harry Bridges, which you mentioned, and the San Francisco Reds book about the Communist Party in San Francisco. And after I had finished the last of those, I was thinking about something to do, and I had realized by then that Masha Zakheim's book was out of print. And so I contacted her heirs and tried to see if it was possible to get it republished, and it turned out, well, maybe, but maybe not. And so at that point, I thought, this is a project that I want to do. I want to look at the Coit Tower murals again. I want to look at them, I hope, with a fresh eye. And I want to look at the controversies at that time and later and later and later, because there were more that happened later on. And to connect those controversies to the other controversies about New Deal art that were going on in San Francisco at the time. Controversies over Victor Arnatuoff's murals at George Washington High School, where I got pulled into that controversy immediately. Controversies over Bernard Zockheim's murals at UCSF, which the UCSF administration wanted to destroy. And I thought it was important to do a book which reviewed these controversies, but also made an argument about preserving New Deal art. So that's probably more than you ever wanted to know.
Well, here's a rather probably quick question. Do you know if FDR ever saw any of the murals?
Not to my knowledge, not the San Francisco ones. I'm sure that he saw the ones that were done later in Washington. There was a big exhibit of PWAP art in the spring of 1934, about the time that they were all finishing up. But of course, it was in Washington. And the best that they could do with the Coit Tower murals was to have a few black and white photographs of them. And, you know, it's not the same to look at a small black and white photographs or to stand next to something in which people are pretty much full-size people.
Well, we do know
So
if
I think that's the closest that Roosevelt ever came to seeing anything in the Coit Tower murals.
the White House, Roosevelt did put up New Deal art in the White House, though. So we know there
Yes,
was
he
some
did.
there.
And at that, he and Eleanor picked out a number of pieces from that exhibition of PWAP art in the spring of 1934, including one by a San Francisco artist, but it was an oil painting.
Um, except perhaps for airports, bridges, and roads, the government programs of the last two generations are far less obvious. Do you believe liberal government in this respect has taken a wrong turn, leading to distrust or dismissal of government as a force for good?
Boy, that's a big question, Harvey. Um, you know, we do still have some, or we have had some federal funds that have been used for the humanities and the arts. The National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts have provided some federal funds, but it's not the same in an important way, because I stressed that one of the important elements of the New Deal art was making art easily available and accessible to large members of the public. They put up art in post offices and courthouses and school libraries and public libraries. They put public art in lots of places, and that just hasn't happened since the end of the New Deal art projects. If there's art in public places now, it comes in about in other ways. And one of the important emphasis of the New Deal art programs was that they wanted art to be easily accessible. And after World War II, that approach to public art was significantly reduced, because after World War II, the whole focus became on abstract expressionism, which doesn't necessarily make art easily accessible to ordinary people, even though the CIA helped to fund some of the early exhibitions of abstract expressionism, because they, CIA and others, saw it as much preferable to the kind of social realism that existed in some of the New Deal art.
Okay, another question from a viewer. Were the Detroit Institute murals by Rivera and the Dartmouth Orozco murals as controversial as the Coit murals?
Well, you're asking me, or your viewer is asking me about something that I know very little about. The Detroit murals, to my knowledge, were not as controversial because they don't have the obvious kind of political message that appeared in some of the Coit Tower murals. There were no hammer and sickle. There was no hammer and sickle in the Detroit murals. There were people at work, which is a political statement, to be sure, to depict in murals in a public place, to depict ordinary working people at work is a bit of a political statement. But it wasn't controversial in the same way that the hammer and sickle of the Clifford White was. And interestingly enough, at the time that Rivera was doing those murals at the Detroit Art Institute, one of the curators there was Walter Heil, who was then soon afterwards appointed as the director of the DeYoung Museum, and soon after that appointed as the director of the local PWAP. So Heil really knew about those Detroit murals, and was one of those who was central in focusing the Coit Tower artists on the style and the palette and the technique of Diego Rivera.
There was actually a cycle of murals that Rivera did that is not that well known because they were in I guess a political setting, not so much a public setting, and that was the New Worker School murals. 21 portable fresco murals. Unfortunately, two-thirds of them were destroyed, but that was essentially Rivera's view from a Marxist viewpoint, or also his viewpoint of American history. So probably would have been highly controversial if they had, been more broadly seen by the public.
Mhm.
I think you perhaps answered this in part, but what lessons can we draw from the Coit Tower mural controversies? Are we facing another time of banning and art censorship?
Well, it seems that these times come around periodically, so we shouldn't be surprised if some of this begins to be again appear in controversy. Um, Read the question again, Harvey. I want to remember the first part of it.
Um, what lessons can we draw from the Coit Tower mural controversies,
Yeah.
facing another time of banning and art
Yeah.
censorship?
Well, I would say that with respect to New Deal art, the lesson to be drawn is don't destroy it. Put it in context. Make sure there's appropriate signage, but don't destroy it because it's a historical artifact and it tells us important things about the time that it was created, just like any historical artifact does. So if there's something that's truly troubling, and when you think about it, if you think about some of the murals, especially in the South, some of them are really pretty blatantly racist. And so what do you do about that? Well, my reaction is that there are other things to do other than destroying the mural. The post office murals especially are portable. They were not painted as fresco. Most of them, and I think maybe probably all of the post office murals, are oil on canvas. And some of those have been successfully removed from the wall and put in museums. Um, if there's something that is so objectionable in New Deal art, that's one way to approach it. If it's possible, put it in a museum where it's put in a context and where it can be explained and understood as a historical statement. The fact that there are some really racist symbols in some New Deal murals actually shouldn't surprise us. If you think about the history of the US and especially the history of the South in the 1930s, the Southern states in the 1930s were all still completely committed to white supremacy. Black people couldn't vote. Black people were segregated throughout the South. It's not a surprise that something like that should appear in post office murals or other public murals created by New Deal art in the 1930s. And when we look at some of those things today, we're going to be upset at a depiction of what we think of as racism. So take it out of such easy public view, but put it where it can be studied. And if it can't be removed, there are still other alternatives to destroying it. One of them might be put a curtain over it. They've done that with a mural at the former post office building in Washington, D.C. They put a curtain over a mural so that it can still be studied, but it's not right there in everyone's face when they walk by.
Well, yesterday was Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we see horrible images, and I think what people say is we shouldn't forget. And I think what the murals do is remind people, hopefully, of what something was in the past. But as you point out, they have to be interpreted also. Another question: in writing your Coit Tower book, did you discover anything that surprised you?
Interesting question. Because my work on the Coit Tower murals was really spread over several different projects. It started long before with my first visit there, and then with the Arnatuoff book, and then with some of the journal articles. So by the time I got to the book, there weren't any big surprises. But let me tell you, every time I go there and look at the murals, I find something new. They're not necessarily shocking or surprising, but you always can find something that you didn't see the first time you went there, or the second time, or the third time, or the fourth time. Last time I was there, one of the people that I was with pointed out some cats in one corner of the mural, which I had never noticed before, that there were some cats in one of the murals. And that's a typical reaction, I hope, for other people. It may not be a surprise, may not be shocking, but I find it endlessly interesting just how complex those murals are and how you can constantly find new things in them.
Well, one of our viewers was looking and has asked if in the murals of the two of the cowboy, on the right, looks like artist Maynard Dixon. Do you know if he was the model?
I do not know that. It wouldn't surprise me because Maynard Dixon's studio was right there on Montgomery Street with many of the other artist studios in the same building with some of the artists who were doing the murals. I have sometimes encountered the statement that the cowboy is modeled on Will Rogers, but I never found no evidence for that. And I think maybe someone was just guessing about that. But that's an interesting speculation because Maynard Dixon was certainly well known to all of the artists who were involved at Coit Tower. Someone should take some photographs, get some photographs of Maynard Dixon from 1934 and take them down there and hold them up and see what you think. That's my advice. I don't know of any evidence about it.
Another question. George Biddle was credited with the idea of commissioning artists to embellish federal buildings, but wasn't Francis Perkins the one to bring up the idea and persuaded FDR to make it happen?
Well, that's an interesting comment. Biddle wrote a letter to Roosevelt in early 1933 and just laid this all out. It was a long letter in which he talked about the Mexican muralists. He talked about Mexican muralists who had worked for what he called plumber's wages to create really magnificent art in public buildings, that American artists were ready to do the same thing, and that his old friend Franklin Roosevelt should give that serious consideration. So I don't know about Frances Perkins coming into the story at all. If your um, viewer has some comment about this, by all means, I'd be interested to know about it. It was Biddle's letter to Roosevelt, which then led to Roosevelt suggesting that Biddle talk to Edward Bruce in the Treasury Department about some kind of a program. And then the program itself came about as a part of the Civil Works Administration, which was administered by Harry Hopkins. Now, Frances Perkins was initiated some very important programs as a part of the New Deal. She really gets the credit more than anyone else for Social Security. But I haven't heard her or encountered any suggestion that she was involved in the creation of the Public Works of Art project.
Yeah, I did hear that her daughter was an artist, and that her daughter encouraged her mother to take some steps to do something. And as we know, Hopkins thought it was a good idea because he said, "Yeah, artists have got to eat too."
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
um, well, a basic question here about how could artists afford paint, or was it supplied to them?
Oh, all the supplies were covered as part of the project. They didn't have to supply their own materials. It was all centralized, in fact. Uh, they adopted the same palette. And as I told you, to do fresco, pigment would be ground and mixed with distilled water to be painted into wet plaster. And there was a centralization for the grinding and the mixing of the paints. There was one of the assistants who had responsible for doing that for all the artists. And there was just one or maybe two plasterers who did that for all the artists. Victor Arnatuoff was a technical coordinator working with that assistant who was grinding the pigments, so that when you go into the main floor of Coit Tower today, there is this amazing uniformity in color. And that's as a consequence of the fact that those sorts of things were centralized.
Yeah, one question here. Did one of the murals include City Lights Bookstore? No, City Lights Bookstore didn't exist at the time, but this was a reference to the film with Charlie Chaplin called City Lights.
Which was also the source of the name of the bookstore
Yes.
later on.
Another question, are there any other cities where joint WPA artists worked together that resulted in similar controversy? Were any of those destroyed, or are any still viewable?
Well, there were other controversies about later about WPA art. There's WPA is a different but very similar New Deal program created in 1935 to provide work for unemployed artists nationwide, and it created an enormous outpouring of art, some of which was controversial. Whether any of it was destroyed, I don't know, frankly. There have been multiple histories of WPA art, and my memory from those that I've gone through is that none of them talk about the destruction of any of it because of controversy. I think that was probably destruction of some of it, especially the easel paintings, simply because there was no place for them. And they were put in storerooms and then eventually sometimes put in the trash heap. But for the murals in the post offices, I don't know of any that were destroyed. That was a different program, though. The post office murals were under the Treasury Department, not WPA.
Okay, I think we've run out of time. So thank you so much, Bob, and to all of you for taking part in tonight's program. Please visit our website, livingnewdeal.org, which documents thousands of New Deal sites across the country and is an ever-expanding resource for educators and anyone interested in learning about the New Deal and those who steered our nation through the Great Depression. If you haven't as yet, please sign up to receive our newsletter, The Fireside. You'll find articles by leading writers and thinkers about the New Deal and its relevance today. And you'll learn about in-person events and online programs like this one. Thank you again for your participation and generous support. We hope to see you again soon, and definitely look at the chat for a special discount on Bob's book. So take down that information. So thanks everyone again for attending, and good night.
Thanks, Harvey. Thanks, everyone.